Thank you very much, James, for this very kind and personal introduction. I'm delighted to be here for a number of reasons, which will become obvious as I proceed. James mentioned my first encounter with the people of the Nida school. That was in 2011. This is a very poor quality picture, but you can still sort of recognize the outlines of some people, probably. And I wanted to start with this picture because that sort of sets the stage or the theme for my talk. I want to talk about translation as an encounter with others, an encounter with oneself. And that's why there'll be a very personal dimension to my talk. Encounters happen between people, between individuals, between persons. Right? And this was a very special encounter in many ways. I would like to single out two individuals who appeared in that picture but have since passed. And I would like to dedicate this talk to their memory. One of them is Professor Martha Chung, and the other one is Ben van Wyk, both of who I met here 7 years ago. You can see this was 7 years ago and probably 10 kilograms ago for me. But both these people, and Antonio, of course, who is there in the middle, and many other people who were in the first picture have since become friends and collaborators and partners in crime in very many ways. So let me start with something that I learned from Martha Chung directly. That knowledge in the humanities is not disinterested or impersonal, but situated. And I would even say that this is a very modest claim. Maybe knowledge as such, not just in the humanities, has this situatedness to it. That quite often it is the who and the how and the when and the where that matter just as much as the what, the content of the knowledge, right? When I think of the formative academic years of my own career, I discovered that it was quite often the who, the people, rather than the subjects they taught that excited me. The subject was sort of secondary, you know? You wanted to listen to that particular professor. You wanted to hear that particular person and sort of experience the engagement with them, rather than the topic of the talk was really quite secondary. So in this sense, I think we get excited by people and only secondarily by ideas. And that's a thought that I would like to plant in this room for the next hour or so, right? To think of translation, of knowledge, of teaching, of education, pedagogy, and so on, in the context of personal, interpersonal relationships, rather than just the exchange of knowledge, dissemination of knowledge, production of knowledge. I don't find these metaphors particularly helpful or illuminating. On the contrary, I find them limiting and reductive. But the reality is that Western, and I put Western in inverted commas to pick up on what Judy was saying, and serendipitously, I must say that I'm extremely delighted to be speaking right after Judy, because there'll be multiple points of dialogue or connection between our talks. Not just Judy's, but other people whom I heard before this week. So Western knowledge is typically descriptive, declarative, and propositional. That's how we think about and conceptualize knowledge, right? The focus is on the what, and especially in the digital age, when we can quantify knowledge, right? When we choose tools based on quantity of information, right? A dictionary that has 50,000 words is, of course, a better dictionary than has 15,000 words or 10,000 words, right? We sort of think about knowledge quite often in these terms. That surely a better library database is the one that has more books in it, more sources, right? With quality is sort of secondary in that paradigm. It's the mass, it's the quantity that matters. That, I fear, results or leads to compartmentalization of knowledge. I knew I would stumble on this word. It has like 50 syllables in it, right? And disciplinary divisions. Well, knowledge is viewed as composed or belonging to sort of discrete units. And this has been challenged during this week already a couple of times, right? So this is a very convenient, perhaps, and administratively sort of efficient way of dealing with knowledge, but it's not really very helpful when it comes to finding out what knowledge really is and how it works. Conversely, or by contrast, I would like to propose, and by now you probably have figured out that what I sort of endorse and agree with, I present in blue, and what I sort of challenge, I present in red. And no pun intended in terms of the American main political parties. The knowledge emerges from a process of a holistic experience, what I call the how in small capitals. And see how I'm even trying to pronounce all these words because they are all key words to me. That is a process of a holistic experience that involves various who's. It's not an interaction with ideas and cannot be reduced to a purely intellectual analysis of facts and figures. To me, that's not knowledge. To me, this is what computers can do. Amass information, categorize it, classify it, all right? I think knowledge is something more than that, goes beyond it. And that, of course, throws up all kinds of big epistemological questions, right? What is knowledge? Maybe even the singular is not really justified. Maybe we should speak about knowledges, like we speak about intelligences or Englishes, right? The concepts that we are sort of used to using in the singular, well, when we look at them closely, they don't really make much sense. So what is it? What are they, perhaps? How is it developed, acquired, and shared? And as I was writing, as I was sort of putting together this presentation and these slides, I was very carefully looking for verbs that would not compromise what I just explained about my perception of knowledge, right? I wanted to say, how is it produced? But produced already presupposes the very mechanistic, automatic almost concept of knowledge. Yeah, thank you for your endorsement. Acquired, maybe there's a better word for it, but shared is definitely a word that to me implies fellowship and community, or at least interpersonal dimension, right? You share knowledge the same way you share food, maybe. And the crucial question to me, and has been for years and years, is how do we know? Not just what do you know, but how do you know? And that's a beautiful way to phrase it in English. In Polish, I would say skąd wiesz? And that's a very different conceptualization. It asks about the source. Where is it that you know it from? Right? So I prefer to conceptualize that part of my thinking about knowledge in English, because how do you know is an extremely broad and profound question. The same way, when I first started learning English, I was tantalized by the question, how are you? Right? It was only then that I sort of pretty quickly realized that it's a very superficial question. You're not supposed to really analyze how you are. But it's, when you think about it, it's a beautiful question. It's an adverbial question, right? It's not about who you are and what you are, but how you are. I don't know how I am. How is it such a multi-dimensional concept, right? That's why I love the how. Which leads me to the concept of know-how. And when I think about know-how, know-how excites me because it's transferable. If you have know-how, you can use that know-how in a variety of contexts. when you think about top CEOs who are headhunted and change careers and companies, that's not because of the know what, that's because of the know-how. If you're a good manager of a pharmaceutical company, you can probably be a good manager of a automobile company, right? The industry matters less than the how of dealing with it. Now, I also like know-how because in the how is very anagrammatic, and how can easily change into who if you just, rearrange the letters around. So to me, how and who are really quite inseparable, right? Quite often, who presupposes or dictates a certain how. I am attracted to people who do things in a certain way. That's why I love, listening to my favorite musicians or reading my favorite authors or poets. Not because of the what. When I buy a new book or buy a new record, I don't know what exactly will be there. But I know the how based on the who, right? I know the style. I know the approach. I know the very elusive something that I prefer to conceptualize the how. Right. Before we go any further with my personal encounters with some thinkers and how that feeds into my thinking about translation, I'd like to suggest, and again, this is not new, just I'd like to remind you maybe or recall this discussion, epistemological discussion about how knowledge is organized, how knowledge works. And very simplistically, we could say that there are two main epistemological models. I'm sure there are more, and maybe there are combinations. Well, let me just, for the sake of simplicity, focus on these two. One is the sort of arborescent model, so the tree-like, and the other one is the rhizomatic. Now, the arborescent model is a very convenient one because it is noticeably simpler than the reality it seeks to organize, right? And in the very many areas, our life and knowledge in our lives is organized according to this model. When you think about university structures, you normally have faculties, schools, departments, chairs, and so on. It's like a tree, right? You have a main unit which just sort of branches out into smaller units. When you think about how books, a little bit of product placement, how books are catalogued, they are catalogued according to that model, right? That there is something called the humanities in which, that particular book is deemed to belong, and so on and so forth. And within humanities, there will be smaller divisions. So it looks like that, more or less. That's the logic behind it, right? At every point, or every sort of, point is a good word actually, on your knowledge tree can be related to other points, but also traced back to a more general or more common node, all right? You don't have to read what it says here. It doesn't really matter. The how matters here, right? The whole idea that if you have a tree, and it doesn't really matter whether you look at the outside, well, the overground part of the tree or the underground part of the tree. And I purposefully chose this image because it depicts it quite well, right? Both the branch system and the root system really follow the same model, right? If you pinpoint your idea somewhere, let's say here, you can trace it back through the bigger branches to the sort of main stem. This is, I would say, the underlying model or logic for projects such as genealogies of knowledge, with all due respect to the research that is going on in that particular project. But the logic is that we can trace certain thoughts, ideas, concepts, we can sort of trace them through history. We can point out to their ancestors, we can sort of think about them in this way. Our genes probably follow that model. We all have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. So in a way, we can trace our genealogy to multiple individuals, right? And this way, our genealogy is like an inverted tree. We start from these multiple points which all converge to in the genetic setup of who we are. But does knowledge work like that? Can we really extrapolate this model to talk productively about knowledge? By contrast, we can think of the rhizomatic model. Again, I don't claim any originality here, it's widely known. But the rhizome, we shouldn't think of it as simply the root system. It's not. The rhizome is, the plant that is rhizomatic has no center, has no defined boundary. Rather, it is made up of a number of semi-independent nodes. They're not independent, they're semi-independent. Each of which is capable of growing and spreading on its own, bounded only by the limits of its habitat. Now, of course, both trees and rhizomes are dynamic structures, right? Trees grow, they develop new twigs and branches. I'm not saying that the arborescent model is static and the rhizomatic model is dynamic. I think it's much more complex than that, of course, right? But I'd like to evoke another important distinction that I think relates to this discussion about trees and rhizomes, in that, to me, interdisciplinarity is arborescent, is tree-like. When you do interdisciplinary research, you still have disciplines. You just try to find the common node, right? You try to come to the source where the two twigs came out of, and you say, well, this is where I situate my research. It's a little bit of that, a little bit of this. This is where we converge. But a tree cannot grow a connection from one branch to another, bypassing the trunk or the stem. See what I mean? So that's the limitation of the model. Whereas a rhizome can do that. And of course, there are legitimate deployments of both of these models. I don't want to say one is bad, one is good, one is simplistic, one is sophisticated. I'm just saying that when we talk about knowledge, maybe we should consider stressing the rhizomatic model more in some areas. Think about our own neural system, how we are wired, which is profoundly relevant to the discussion of knowledge. Of course, we have the central nervous system. So there is an element of a tree-like structure, right? There is some centrality. But our brain is wired in a much more complex way. There are connections that can develop. There are connections that can atrophy. Stronger connections emerge and are consolidated when you exercise a certain kind of mental activity, right? So this is a model which is much more plastic, much more flexible. That's why I find it more useful in thinking about knowledge, and I think it also allows us to theorize transdisciplinarity a little better. Transdisciplinarity is something to me that questions the whole idea of disciplines as discrete units. They may still be nodes, but these nodes are semi-dependent. They are, contextual, so to speak. They can atrophy, or they can grow stronger. In order for you to boast your ability to cross boundaries, you have to recognize them in the first place and legitimize them in a way. So that's why, transdisciplinarity speaks more strongly to my imagination and to the reality of my research and thinking than just interdisciplinarity. But again, this is open to discussion, and I realize that others may think about these concepts differently. Right, so this is the sort of background, theoretical background to my thinking. And I would like to evoke the images and and personalities of two scholars who have contributed to this discussion, who say in the introduction to the inaugural issue of translation, the journal Translation, they say that a rhizomatic transdisciplinary approach, which is centered around translation, may offer us a different way of facing the great epistemological questions of what we know and how we know, which I think is, if not more important, then at least needs to be stressed more strongly. You will notice that whenever I quote people and scholars here, I'd be providing their images as well. That's again, I want to be true to my commitment of encountering people, not just their ideas. Right? We've met Stefano, we've met Siri, we've spoken to them, right? They are actual people. It matters to me that this idea came from these two, who I know personally. They're not just some abstract, anonymous ideas. They're situated to me and to you. Here's Doug Robinson, for example, who says this in his 1991 book. Translation theories, like their colleagues in the so-called human sciences, like to talk about texts, intertextualities, structures of correspondence, and the like, all hypostatized, thank you James, never fail, hypostatized abstractions. Now, but the reality of translation and all human communication is people. And that's another strong suggestion that I would like to plant among us today, right? Let's forget about texts for the time being, if I may suggest so, and let's think about translation as encounter. And of course, this whole idea of translation as encounter, according to the rhizomatic model, can be accessed through various points of entry, right? There are people like Martin Buber or Emanuel Levinas who don't necessarily speak about translation, but speak about this idea of relationships, of encountering others. Buber speaks about the I-thou relationship, which is really what makes us human. Levinas speaks about these dual acts of distancing and relating, and his key notion or idea is that of alterity. So I know that for some people, like Michael, who's, I feel hugely out of my depth saying anything about Levinas with Michael sitting here. I know that for Michael, his point of entry into those ideas was through dialogic philosophy, right? Mine wasn't. It was only after I met Michael that I realized, same ideas or similar ideas are being explored in a different part of the rhizome. And I made the connection then. So here's my plea for the next 25, 30 minutes. Let's forget about texts. And we've spoken about texts enough. If I may invite you on this journey with me, let's try to reimagine history and reimagine translation theory. Let's try to unlearn Chandrani and Judy, something that we've been taught, and the ruts in which we often get stuck, right? And when I say text, I primarily mean the written text, but also text may be in the broader sense, as language and communication, right? It will be there inevitably in the background somewhere, but let's not focus on it at least. Let's think of the encounter. Now, my problem with encounter is that quite often it is theorized along similar lines. Especially when you read anthropologists, early anthropologists, they're incredibly racist and sexist and imbalanced in terms of power, and when you think about it, naive. I did a little bit of reading about the Polish ethnographic tradition, and I discovered, much to my delight, that the natives who were supposed to be studied by the anthropologists quite often pulled pranks on them. They said, oh, here comes the anthropologist, put this pot on your head, and then you let him figure out what it means in our culture, right? How do you know, as the anthropologist, that what you see as who you see as your subjects are authentic in any meaningful sense of that word, right? Maybe they're responding to you already. Maybe they are showing you what you want to see. And of course, almost without exceptions, these ethnographers and anthropologists were white males, speaking to quite often black males, right? The gender dimension is really quite crucial here, and the racial dimension is obvious. That's quite an old chestnut. When you read Quine and his indeterminacy of meaning, right? When he speaks in word and object about this hypothetical encounter of an ethnographer with a native, he uses the native, but I really hear savage somewhere there, right? It's an uncivilized native. And then the native informant, upon seeing a rabbit, says, Gavagai. And then Quine says, well, see, we have no way of telling what the reference is. It can mean, here, there's a rabbit, or look, there's a rabbit, or let's go hunting, or any number of other things. What we have is just this utterance which we interpret based on our preconceptions and the contextual considerations and so on and so forth. But think about this image. Think about how we spoke a little bit about, I mentioned the racial and the gender dimensions, right? Inevitably, two males. But what if one of them was a woman? What if there were two women involved? What if they didn't simply talk about didn't have the intellectual discussion about rabbits or whatever Gavagai really means, but what if they had some common purpose? What if they were hungry and needed food? Or what if they were sharing the better morsels of that said rabbit around the campfire? Right? That is a very different image of that encounter. What if the encounter looked like this? Let's remove the civilizational imbalance. Let's remove the gender dimension and replace it with gender difference. Maybe age, maybe race, put it in one of the world's bustling metropolitan centers, and you have a different image of the encounter. What if there is sexual attraction between the two? Right? What if you want to impress the other person? Or what if you don't like the other person? People smell. People have unpleasant voices, or have lovely voices. People have nice hair or not so nice hair to our perception. See what I mean? Encountering another person is not just a decontextualized intellectual act. It's an actual meaning, act of meeting somebody. And not sure if you remember the image that I put on the very first slide. This is I'll come back to it in due course, but this is an image of a monument in the city of Derry, or should I say Londonderry, or should I say the Stroke City. This is the very name of that city is contested in Northern Ireland, right? For historical and sectarian reasons. But that is an image which is really quite ripe with meaning, and we'll come back to it in due course. So once again, no textual thinking for the next 10 minutes or 15, if I may ask. And that approach to ignore texts in some way or to bypass them actually popped up in my research in places where I didn't expect it. So I spoke to a couple of translators and translation theorists I knew, and I asked them to explained to me or described to me situations in which they felt a special connection between them as translators and the text, any text. And this is what Elżbieta Skibińska, a good colleague from Wrocław University and a co-author of a couple of publications, wrote to me in a personal email. She wrote in Polish, so that's my translation into English. She says, when I read Kavafi, the Greek poet, she doesn't say his texts or his poems. Note that in the very first opening line, she says, when I read him. She uses this metonymy. Right? He demands that I should translate him for myself. Of course, let me explain that Kavafi is long dead. We're not talking about an actual relationship. Or are we? Without looking at Kubiak, Miłosz, Libera, Kania, Yourcenar, or other French translators, no one has ever wanted this from me, she says. I don't know why he does. And then she puts a smiley face there. And let me just say it loud and clear that Elżbieta Skibińska is not just like a romantic poet who would think about translation in this very sentimental way. She's an incisive, formidable scholar educated in the French tradition. And then, despite of who she is and how she is, she chose to respond to my question unprompted in this way, highlighting the personal encounter. So this is not just my, intuitions. That is not just my isolated experience. I see elements of similar thinking throughout the big rhizome that I am a part of. I think if you consider interpreting, this gives us another useful focus around the who and the personal encounter. Think about interpreting in medical contexts, political or sort of social contexts, legal contexts. Those of you who have interpreted or who interpret will certainly testify that it matters who you work for, who you interpret. How can you interpret a person you don't like? Don't you think it will color your interpretation? How can you interpret a person whom you had just an argument with, who humiliated you in the previous session, and now here you are interpreting the following lecture? Wouldn't you be tempted to return the favor somehow, or at least to expose them somehow? See, that there is an interpersonal dimension to your interpretation already. This is why, in this sector, so much importance is attached to codes of conduct. Because it is widely recognized that your personal prejudice or your personal history will color your interpreting to the extent of its being unusable or unreliable. Okay? So you have to declare a conflict of interest. In legal settings, for example, you cannot interpret for somebody who you know or who you're related to because of that assumption. That it's not just the translation or interpretation of the message of the text, it's the person who will influence your how. Could you interpret for somebody who had hurt your friends and family and now is being tried? Or somebody who you have a personal opinion in terms of their guilt or lack thereof? This is a very difficult ground to navigate for legal interpreters, for medical interpreters, right? This is that central difficulty of that profession. Maybe in translation we don't see it as clearly, but it's there. I declined translation commissions on a number of occasions because I just couldn't really see myself translating that, because I didn't agree with it. I didn't think it was worthwhile. I thought it was, I didn't want to have a part in that. And likewise, there are people I would love to translate for or interpret for. And it works both ways. I worked with clients who called me once and never called me again. Well, clearly something didn't work. As Anna said about mentoring, right? The connection between the mentee and mentor doesn't always work, and we don't know why. Maybe there's a personality clash, maybe there's, the pheromones are not there, or the wrong pheromones are there, we don't know. But conversely, there were also people who asked for me as their interpreters over and over again, and after a period of time they just couldn't or wouldn't work with anyone else if I was available, right? And again, not because of my linguistic abilities, I suppose, or not primarily, but because there was a connection, because we developed a working relationship, because there was trust. So I'd like to take you a step further on this journey, and in agreement with Judy, what she said about insightful comments relevant to translation that come from elsewhere, I'd like to share with you a couple of insights from anthropology, but not just from anthropology, from Clifford Geertz, whom I never met. So I have with him this imaginary relationship that Skibinska has with Cavafy. But I enjoyed his reading, and I found them profoundly insightful long before I thought of applying them to translation. I connected with him at this intellectual level somehow, or not just intellectual, emotional, maybe level of your sensitivity, level of your thinking about your work. And it didn't matter that he didn't work in translation studies. But as I read his work, as I entered into his thinking, into the how of his thinking, it seemed to me that it had enormous relevance to translation. I don't know how much you know about Geertz. I won't really, I'm not prepared to introduce him in a very comprehensive way, but I only say that based on what I know, he ended up as an anthropologist really quite by chance. That again, this wasn't something that he chose and planned for necessarily. It was just he somehow ended up as in the course of his life, and then produced one of the most insightful works in that particular branch of symbolic anthropology. I'll mainly be drawing on these two books, The Interpretation of Cultures, which is one of those books that I read and I said to myself, man, I should have written this book, right? How did he know what I thought? Of course, I felt, hugely inadequate compared with his eloquence and everything else. I would never have been able to write this book, of course. But there are books that you write and say, man, that's exactly what I was thinking, except that he is able to articulate it so much better. So that's one of these books, and Available Light, Anthropological Reflections on Philosophical Topics is another. Just to give you a sample of the kinds of snippets that I got attracted to in the first book, Interpretation of Cultures, Geertz, like almost in passing, says something like that. It's not necessary to know everything in order to understand something. And to a young, aspiring, early career researcher, this was a revelation, right? Wow, I can say something, or I can try to understand something where I am. Of course, that does not, cancel the obligation to do research and read and orient yourself, but it sort of takes some of the pressure off. But you don't have to be an expert in everything in order to understand something. As you were coming in, I played a little bit of music, and some of that music came from this guy, Pat Metheny, who I've been listening to for 30 years, I suppose. And this is, I put his picture here because I want to illustrate the principle that I applied in my book and in my recent project. I thought, what if Pat Metheny made a movie or wrote a book? Would I buy it? Would I see it? Of course I would. Not because what I know is in that movie or in that film or in that book, but because I like the how of his music. And then I thought, well, maybe I thought, what would happen if these people whose thinking I find inspirational and encouraging, what if these people had been translation studies scholars? What if these people who are such inspiring thinkers had been theorizing translation? And then I thought, well, maybe they had in some way. Maybe Matheny is a philosopher as much as he is a musician. And this is basically the idea behind this book, Ubiquitous Translation, parts of which I will be sharing in the next few minutes. I reread a collection of insights which were originally made with reference to something else than translation. I retranslated them, or I translated them to refer to translation. And this is what Geertz says about anthropology, or in my translation, about translation. And I try to be ethical in not putting words in people's mouths, but whenever I conceptually translate one concept into another, I put them in the new concept in small capitals with an asterisk, and this is the word that he originally used. Right? But as I told you, he ended up in anthropology almost by chance. So, he happened to explore it, it excited him, but I think it's really entirely plausible that the kind of person he was, he would have said something like that about any other discipline he would have ended up in. Right? So let's imagine that Geertz is a translation studies scholar for a couple of minutes, and he would have said something like that. One of the advantages of translation as a scholarly enterprise is that no one, including its practitioners, quite knows exactly what it is. Isn't that true? Even based on the last week, or last 2 weeks, the discussions that we had about what translation is, and is that a part of translation studies or not? How far does the concept extend, and so on and so forth. To me, this is one of the main attractions of this discipline, again, that you can do pretty much anything and still situate it in the context of translation studies, because translation, to me, is ubiquitous. Translation is this concept which is really the rhizome of translation is really quite extensive. Let me put it this way. Geertz quotes Wittgenstein, the late Wittgenstein, right, as you normally distinguish between the two. And Wittgenstein says something like that. We have got on to slippery ice, where there is no friction, and so in a certain sense conditions are ideal. But also, just because of that, we are unable to walk. We want to walk, so we need friction. Back to the rough ground. That's how Geertz explains what excited him about anthropology. He says the notion of that translation is exploring the rough ground on which it is possible for thought to gain traction is for me not only a compelling idea in itself, it is the idea unfocused and unformulated that led me to migrate into the field in both senses of field in the first place. And when I first read it and translated it to refer to translation, then I thought, yes, this is exactly what excites me about translation. As opposed to comparative linguistics, let's say, or contrastive linguistics, which excites me as well, but in a different way, right? Yesterday, Michael asked a couple of us a provocative question whether, if you were to do a PhD in philosophy or in translation studies, which one would you choose and why, right? And, we sort of had a funny discussion around it, but then I thought about this question a little more, and I thought, I'm not sure if you could write about translation doing a PhD in philosophy, but you can definitely write about philosophy doing a PhD in translation studies. Right? To me, translation studies is in some sense a stronger node than philosophy. Maybe they are the same thing. But that's the beauty of rhizomes, that you don't have to settle these questions. Is philosophy a part of translation studies or vice versa? We don't know. It doesn't matter. Translation isn't like that. Philosophy perhaps can be like that. Translation studies with capital T and capital S possibly could be like that. And this is what Brian was warning us against. That when we have this disconnect between theory and practice, between this, translation studies and actual translation, then yes, conditions are ideal in a certain sense. But what do we learn about the subject of our study as such? It's not like that either. You can't have armchair translation studies as you can have armchair philosophy or armchair linguistics. Even armchair linguistics is problematic because, a theory is only as good as it helps you explain practice or describe the phenomena. And again, Geertz says something like that. It's important to say something and not just threaten to say something. And that again sums up to me the beauty of translation. A translation isn't simply debating the theoretical possibilities of conveying that part of the meaning. When you translate, you can't simply say, it depends. And when my students give me translations that sort of ask me to delete as appropriate, I say, sorry, but this is not a translation. You haven't done your job. I'm not asking you for a list of possible options or a list of dictionary equivalents. I'm asking you for a translation, and that implies choice, but that also implies responsibility for that choice. You can give me any number of footnotes in your translation to justify, explain, qualify your choice, fine. But in the end, at the end of the day, I need a translation, right? Imperfect as it is, tentative as it is. And I think this is the difference that also popped up in one of our discussions, right? About the difference between comparative literature, contrastive linguistics, and translation. And to me, that is the crucial link, that translation actually does something, not just speculates about something or hypothesizes something. And let me give you a couple of examples that this concept of translation, as used in other elements of our big social rhizome, is really about that punch, that impact. I've seen pictures which have been photoshopped of that image, and it's not his index finger that is, being shown. Anyway, have a look at these couple of quotations from leading world politicians. US presidents and Israeli politicians and European leaders. Ronald Reagan, 1984. We must translate the idea into action. Jose Manuel Barroso. Now we must translate the principles of coordination into concrete and concerted actions. Ehud Olmert. Now we must translate that commitment into actions. Barack Obama. We must translate this knowledge into action. Think about the concept of translation used in politics, nothing to do with texts, but everything to do with translation. Translation is about actualizing, about making a difference, about taking something that is ethically problematic and unfinished and delivering on it. Of course, that is a double-edged sword. Translation can also have this sinister, dubious, threatening, bullying aspect to it. And those of you who chose to read one of the pieces I uploaded will have access to some of the other examples that illustrate the dark side of translation, if you like. But that's, to me, a great example of how the concept of translation is picked up for its central relevance in other contexts, by politicians or by medics. The whole idea of translational medicine or translational research, again, picks up perhaps only one aspect of what translation is or what it does, but it's really, again, quite illuminating. I don't know how much you know about translation medicine or research, and that's why I chose a couple of quotations that explain it. It is the responsibility of those of us involved in today's biomedical research enterprise to translate the remarkable scientific innovations we are witnessing into health gains for the nation. So the whole idea of translational research starts from the observation that there is a gap, that there is research here, but research which is not seeking to be relevant, or it's not looking towards its purpose and its application, is ethically problematic. In biomedical sciences, research for research's sake is just unethical. These are not funded just to give us insight into, how certain drugs work. They are meant to make a difference to the society, to the nation and its health. So quite often there is this idea of gap that needs to be bridged, the gap between what's happening in universities and in our labs and what is happening by the hospital beds and what gets taken up by companies. And this is even called the translational gap. Translation is seen as something that bridges that gap. And of course I am aware that this concept or this image is also problematic. And Michael Cronin quite eloquently writes about translation being a much more complex enterprise than simply bridging gaps and covering the divides and stuff like that. That translation quite often separates as much as it brings together, and that is its value as well. But I just wanted to show these two examples of applying the translation concept to illustrate that it's the power to deliver, it's the artifactedness of translation that matters. It's not just scratching your head and saying, well, it depends. Translators get their hands dirty and their feet wet in a very real sense. When you think about interpreters who work, community interpreters especially, who work in disaster zones and conflict situations and war zones, I can't think of a more powerful example than that. Translation is profoundly contextual. So I like to think about translation and interpreting as something like that. That you meet people, you represent people. Maybe it's not as obvious as in this picture. Maybe sometimes this encounter is mediated by a text. But in the end, it boils down to the interpersonal encounter with others. And of course, that brings up a whole range of questions around power and control and ownership and so on. And it's broadly recognized that translation usually takes place between unequal societies. Just as languages are not commensurate or asymmetrical, they are not equal in terms of power. And Geertz also, as an anthropologist, speaks about the complex of claims and concessions only dimly recognized that hold between the anthropologist and his or her informant. Think about it. If you were an informant being interviewed by or observed by an anthropologist, wouldn't you be asking questions such as, what does he really want from me? What is his agenda? How do I know that what I say will be truthfully represented? What if he gets it wrong? What if he humiliates me? Right? Do I give up the ownership of the information I provided to the anthropologist? Is it his or her to do whatever they want to do with it now? Or can I still correct them, check it? See what I mean? It's a very complex, ethically and otherwise, situation. And I think the key element, once again, when I think about interpersonal relationships, is trust. The inherent moral asymmetry of the translation situation, says hypothetically Geertz, is not wholly avoidable, let's face it, but part of the ethically ambiguous character of that situation as such. Translation and interpreting presupposes moral asymmetry. You have a very difficult relationship with the author. You have a difficult relationship with your audience, right? Just as anthropologists have to study their subjects and then report on their research to their constituencies. And as I said, I think trust is at the center of it. Is it assumed? Should you be expecting that people will give you the benefit of the doubt and just simply trust you unless you fail? Or should you earn that trust first? So what is the baseline that you start from? as a translator, as an interpreter? And of course, that depends. In contested situations, I would assume that there is lack of trust as the baseline, and you have to earn it, you have to build it, you have to prove it. In other situations, when you have at least a common purpose, then I think you would have some degree of assumed trust. And unless you do something to shatter it, it should be there. But again, I spoke to translators and asked them about the issue of trust, whether they expect to be trusted or whether they are prepared to present their credentials and earn that trust. And I discovered, well, not perhaps surprisingly, that trust is transferable to a large extent. That we tend to trust those who are trusted by those we trust. Right? That credentials are only as good as the person who provided them. And as our degree of, knowledge or trust in that person. It doesn't matter what the letter of reference really says if I distrust the person who provided it. And likewise, I can read between the lines if a letter of reference comes from a person I trust and respect. So is it guaranteed in a translation or interpreting situation by involvement or by detachment? Should we as translators and interpreters strive to be, neutral, uninvolved, removed? That's a very anthropological question. That's exactly the question that ethnologists and ethnographers struggle with. To what extent should I be a part of that situations I'm observing? Is it better to be involved and acknowledge that? Or is it better to pursue detachment? And on that topic, Geertz says this: I don't know much about what goes on in laboratories, but in translation, detachment is neither a natural gift nor a manufactured talent. It is a partial achievement laboriously earned and precariously maintained. So even though at the surface he seems to be advocating detachment, that is a very different detachment than we would think without this explanation. Always partial, always precarious, perhaps uncomfortable. Very fluid and dynamic. The outstanding characteristic of translation as a form of conduct is that it does not permit any significant separation of the occupational and extra-occupational spheres of one's life. On the contrary, it enforces the fusion. Much as you can't be an unethical anthropologist, but an ethical person, or vice versa, the same applies to translation. And when I read codes of conduct for translators and interpreters, they don't make a distinction between on duty and off duty. On the contrary, there is quite often an insistence that as a person, you will not be undermining your colleagues, you will not be undercutting the rates, you will not be acting in a way that would bring the profession into disrepute, and so on and so forth. It sort of tries to mandate or prescribe the sort of person you should be, and not just what you should do. So this fusion is really quite real when you look at codes of conduct. And then Geertz says this about anthropologists: we have sought to keep the world off balance. Pulling out rugs, upsetting tea tables, setting off firecrackers. It has been the office of others to reassure, ours is to unsettle. We hawk the anomalous, peddle the strange, merchants of astonishment. And again, that's not about building bridges. That's not about, making others understood. It's more about highlighting sensitively and meaningfully, but difference and strangeness, or strangenesses in the plural. In another place, Geertz says that foreignness does not start at the water's edge, or the water's edge, let me re-stress it, but the skins. Foreignness is not something external. It's something internal. And this is where I come to the second part of my title. And please don't assume that I'm going to take as much time discussing the second part as the first. The job of translation, says Geertz in my own translation, or one of them anyway, is indeed to provide narrative and scenarios to refocus our attention, but ones which will make us visible to ourselves by representing us and everyone else as cast into the midst of that world full of irremovable strangenesses we can't keep clear of. That's a great reminder to me about it's time to finish once I start stumbling in my English. But I found this a powerful image. These strangenesses that can't be removed, and yet they make not only others visible to ourselves, but ourselves visible to ourselves. Now, to quote Michael from 15 years ago, so I chose a picture that corresponds to that period of his life. Understanding a mindset different from one's own is no longer the specialist skill of the ethnographer, but an everyday life skill of the urban dweller. Because what was previously found between societies is now increasingly found within them. The diversity, the difference, the misunderstanding. And on that topic, Geertz says, understanding in the sense of comprehension, perception, and insight that needs to be distinguished from understanding in the sense of agreement of opinion, union of sentiment, or commonality of commitment. To understand doesn't mean to endorse or to agree with, necessarily. And here's another node in my rhizome, another patchwork that I feel connects very strongly to what Judy was describing earlier. That we are living more and more in the midst of an enormous collage, says Geertz. And he explains that in the next quotation. But he says confronting landscapes and still lifes is one thing, and panoramas and collages is another. You can't simply bring your viewing skills from landscapes and still lifes and hope that you would have a meaningful viewing experience when confronted with a collage. A collage implies motion. You have to come closer and you have to step out. You need to recognize the various elements. Some will be new, some will be old, some will be recycled. They will not patch perfectly. And on that topic, Geertz says, to live in a collage, one must in the first place render oneself capable of sorting out its elements, determining what they are, which usually involves determining where they come from and what they amounted to when they were there, and how, practically, they relate to one another, without at the same time blurring one's own sense of one's own location and one's own identity within it. We must learn to grasp what we cannot embrace. And I find it extremely liberating that understanding does not imply agreement, and vice versa, perhaps. The difficulty in this is enormous, as it has always been, he says. Comprehending that which is alien to us and likely to remain so without either smoothing it over with vacant murmurs of common humanity, disarming it with to each his own indifferentism, or dismissing it as charming, lovely even, but inconsequent, is a skill we have arduously to learn, and having learned it, always very imperfectly to work continuously to keep it alive. It is not a connatural capacity like depth perception or a sense of balance upon which we can complacently rely. There's a lot of work that goes into translation, understood as living in a collage. And I think I'll just stop here. I had another story to share with you. I'll just mention that Eva Hoffman, author of Lost in Translation, speaks very powerfully about the experience of her own translation or translation of herself. And there's also a personal connection, because I had a privilege of interviewing her a year ago and having the chance to ask a couple of questions to her. So there is also a personal dimension to how she speaks to me about these things. You will you can learn, you can find out more about this book and the excerpts in my slides. I'll upload them. Just a final closing note on this statue. As you know, Northern Ireland is a divided society. Still very, very real, these divisions are. So in the city of Derry, there is this monument called Hands Across the Divide. Now, it depends how you view it, because monuments, being three-dimensional objects, allow a number of perspectives. And this is quite often how it is presented and depicted. You have the divide, you have the walls, you have the two statues standing there, and when you view it like that, they're holding hands, they're touching. Well, this talk was largely about people who have touched me in a variety of ways with their ideas, but also with who they were and how they were. But I think the important part is that there is always this rupture. This is a very idealistic image when presented this way, but I don't think it's true. So I'd like to leave on this slightly upsetting note, if you allow me, which is very much in line, I believe, with what Geertz is saying about living in a collage and understanding others. It's a difficult process, it's an upsetting process, it's never complete. And ultimately, these hands in Northern Ireland and elsewhere are not really touching. They're very close. And there's a big hermeneutical lesson here as well. How much do you think you've connected with what I was talking about, with who I am, with me? Are we touching hands or just about to? Thank you very much.